What's up, everyone? It's Anchor Pete, and I am super excited because I'm doing another interview episode. And I'm doing an interview episode with Mr. Jonathan Nevair. Jonathan, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Pete. I really appreciate it.
He was able to send me a copy of his book, Goodbye to the Sun, and I read it, and I'm very eager to talk about it today. And he actually has a new book that just came out this week, too, JATI'S Wager. And so we're going to talk about both books and his whole series, too, his Wind Tide series. You've made this universe. This is your universe that your trilogy is based in. What would you say makes the Wind Tide series unique?
What makes it unique? I think there's a couple of things. I mean, from a social standpoint, I think one of the things that's really unique about it is I kind of invented almost like a progressive, forward, futuristic version of what I imagined our world here might be like in terms of social relations. So, and a lot of that has to do with things around, I guess, sort of gender and acceptance with family. So there's a kind of a real accepted system of how people choose to identify themselves that seems to just flow. So there's no tension with it. There's no issues with it. There's no discrimination with it. It's just kind of an accepted part of society. They've already gone through a cycle of conflict with that. And so that kind of settles identity in a cool way, where I guess a lot of characters, and you mentioned Jati, for example. So you get a lot of characters who, identify themselves very differently across a broad spectrum.
Right.
But it's just a totally normative cultural condition. And I think that's one of the unique things about it. And it's interesting because I get some feedback on both. I get people who think, who have written things where they've said, "Oh, this is great. I really like this. I like this idea of creating a world where there's this kind of acceptance, and it's just so normative." And then I've had other people be like, "It doesn't really do anything to the story or the world because there's no tension or conflict about it. Why are you putting it in here?" And it's been interesting to hear that as well. Like, I don't understand why this needs to be in here. And for me, it's like, well, it needs to be in here because it's a vision of a future and a society that I've created as a kind of almost, I don't know, a hope.
Yes.
So that's one thing, and it bleeds over to family. So I choose to avoid terms like father and mother. You probably noticed I used parent.
Right.
And I came up with the same problem. I started writing or proofing and editing, and I realized I was using daughter and son, and I thought I can't do that, so I removed that. And it sounds a little strange sometimes to hear an older adult refer to their grown child as a child.
Right.
But I did that, and sibling replaced sister and brother. So linguistically, in terms of social relations, that was one thing that I think was unique about it. Like a lot of space operas, there's a number of different worlds, and I think the color. I get a lot of comments about color.
Yeah.
My background is in art and art history, so I'm really into aesthetics. I'm really into Blade Runner 2049 right now, like the Cyberpunk aesthetics and that movie, right?
Yes.
It's just so visually beautiful. But I loved being able to kind of break the barrier, I think, a little bit, or really push it with color. So things that wouldn't normally be within a color spectrum take on that color spectrum. And I think those are some of the ways in a visual and a social way that I tried to create a unique world.
So when it comes to science fiction, that always intrigues me, and I'm so lucky to get to talk to you today, because along the lines of that first question, was it really based upon the future that you envisioned, or did you kind of have the plot and then you kind of built the future around the plot?
Yeah, I think I had the characters. I would start with the characters because I'm a character-driven writer. I think you can see that, when you read the book, you're really feeling the feelings of the characters, and the story is really moving based on their behavior, decisions, and their thoughts. They're not being moved by events around them as much as I think we're experiencing their inner worlds. And so I think I start with the character, and then from the character, the plot. And then I think lastly comes the world for me, which is weird in a way, but I think that's kind of the order in which that happens. And then the world kind of builds itself around it. And, a lot of people you'll see, I mean, I notice a lot of science fiction authors, especially who write space opera, often identify themselves as speculative fiction writers, right?
Yeah, yes.
And I think that that's one of the real, for me, one of the best parts of science fiction, and fantasy can do it too, but one of the best parts is that spec fiction component where, you know, you can speculate.
I could just tell, like, the amount of effort that you put into the world building. I mean, how long did it take you to conceptualize this whole trilogy?
Yeah. So here's for me, and I know other writers do this too.
Yeah.
You know, you have to write around the book a lot. So sometimes I just start like literally, like for lack of a better word, just kind of vomiting out all this stuff that flows through your head about the political systems, you know, about the economics and the commerce and the kind of class tensions and the different aspects of how language works. And you kind of, oftentimes you write a history, a little bit of a kind of before and even an after, and then you write a periphery even around it of all this other stuff that's going on. And then there's your story, and it's like you kind of just pull in from that whole larger content just enough to tell your story without overdoing it, because you don't want to have too much exposition and bog people down in the details. But you need to, it's that Goldilocks, like you need to find the right amount to make the world feel real and big and tangible, but not to get it bogged down and overwhelm the story. And that's hard to do, I find. But I write around it. That's my short answer. Like I write around it. So for example, like I kind of wrote a history of the first and second span, even though this takes place in what's called the third span. It's kind of like epics, you know, and even though we're in the third, the first and second is kind of, I know what happened there. And you know what leads up to the Patent War, for example, which is the starting, this memory of Keen Drayden's past and JATI'S past as veterans. You know, like what led to the Patent War, right? And like, you know, then what came afterwards to the point where this book starts.
Like you really do focus on your two characters so much, you know. And I know that you incorporated that dynamic to where Razor, you have like an internal narrative, like every other chapter. And so I was thinking, just for people that haven't read the book yet, do you want to kind of go into Razor and Keen too?
Yeah. So, I mean, the book is set up in a kind of interesting way. It's a little unorthodox in the POVs, because what I did was I toggle every chapter between a first person narrative from the point of view of Razor, who is one of the two main characters, who is a mote and is born on this planet called Cole 2, and whose people live in an oppressed condition, basically. Their culture is fractured. And I wanted that complication too. I didn't want it to be a typical, you know, sort of colonized trope where there's an oppressed culture on a planet. I wanted it to be more complicated. And so the culture itself became fractured and had a kind of a civil war, and half of them agreed to the kind of colonized temptations and the benefits of it, and the other half opposed it and wanted to keep an autonomy, right, in their own culture, and that caused the split. And Razor is that group, is that person, and I like the first person voice with her because it gives you a real internal and very personal kind of a reaction in a way to what's going on. And it's also 60 or so years in the future. And so you get this weird tension because Keen Drayden, who's the other main character, who is now an ambassador, who is a kind of washed up, you know, ex-soldier who's, you know, his parent disapproves of him. His brother, who was always better than him, died in the war. You know, that's enough. I won't give too much away, but he's a disappointment, you know, and he's kind of given up on caring about anything. And you experience his reality as it happens to him in third person limited. So you experience the story from Keen's point of view. And so then you get this kind of constant back and forth. And I got really into it because it gives you this ability to kind of understand how complicated reality is. And depending on who you are, your reality is going to be very different from someone else. And so I really wanted that in there. Like I wanted you to constantly have this experience of, oh, Keen's angry and pissed off in this scene and feels like he's offended. And Razor feels like, you know, she's upset. She feels like she's been, you know, someone's been offensive to her. and she feels like someone's trying to take her agency away from her. And I wanted that complication in there, and I think that POV kind of worked with that a little bit. There is some issues, some people have told me like, oh, kind of, it slows the plot a little bit, the reflective parts of it, and that's cool. I did it the way I wanted to do it, and for me, it worked as a dynamic. Yeah.
Well, I mean, to me, I really like both of them, and I also like the bounty hunter too. And but I know that this has been inspired by Antigone too. Now, I personally have never seen Antigone, the actual play. I once dated a girl who ran the play when she was in college, and she got like awards for it and stuff too.
Happen to have my copy right now.
Oh, boom! Okay, perfect. And so, like you said that this was kind of driven by character first. So were there specific characters from Antigone that inspired these characters?
Yes, but that said, and I do go over this in the author's note. I'm very careful to make clear it's inspired by, it's not a retelling. Right. So I would say you can't go to Antigone and find a character in Antigone specifically and say like, oh, Creon is so and so, or Antigone is so and so, Ismene is so and so. You can't make those straight parallels. Instead, what I did was I used the tragic model, kind of Sophoclean style tragedy. So there's these plot points that you get, which you get in a lot of tragedies. Like there's one called hamartia and peripetia, these Greek words. Like there's these moments that have to happen for tragedy mechanics to work in a storyline. Sure. But I did think very closely about the themes of Antigone. Specifically, the theme of family versus state. This theme of like the having to make choices, right, between one's responsibility to one's family and bloodline and their responsibility to the collective or the state. And I think both Razor and Keen both confront that in very different ways in the story, and each of them, as a result, has moral dilemmas that they have to make decisions about. And while they look very different, I feel like in the end, even though the choices and the situations of their decisions are very different, they're kind of both battling the same thing. They're just coming at it from opposite poles. But there's qualities and passages in Antigone that definitely relate. I would say the chorus, in a lot of these Greek tragedies, you always have this chorus that comes in every so often. In the writing of the chorus sections in Antigone are just amazing. They're beautiful, and the power of the words are just unbelievable. But also, there's like messages in there about having power over the world. And I feel like the environmental themes that I get into are partly inspired a little bit by that as well. I mean, as well as like Dune and other things. But, Razor, there's a kind of lyricism and a lamentation, I feel like, or I hope, in Razor, in those passages. There's a kind of like a eulogy to the way she writes. There's a tragedy and a tone to her passages that I tried to capture from the chorus in Antigone. Whereas, the Keen sections are more like you said, like the plot is rolling, right? Like what's happening, we're doing this, we're yelling at each other, we're fighting to survive in this situation. I feel like hers are very heavily weighted in a way that Antigone in the play was heavily weighed down with tragic decisions and consequences.
Your books, like, they have excellent artwork on the cover. I've seen the cover for Goodbye to the Sun. Obviously, I have it, right? And then JATI'S Wager too. And then you shared some images with me, some are on your website too. I was going to ask you, is that all the same artist that does all the work?
Yeah, so it's a couple different people, and I wish I could show you. I have this one too, and actually, my author copies of JATI'S Wager are arriving today, and I was hoping they would get here before the interview, and they didn't. But somebody else on Twitter posted they had one, and it looks great. So all of the covers are by the same artist, and they're by a Chinese artist, and that Chinese artist Li Zuan is someone who does these great digital paintings. And what I did was I took a collection of those that I just really liked, and they're all on my website. Everything on the website is by the same artist. And there were a couple that I just grabbed and was like, that's a cover. Because I saw the Goodbye to the Sun cover, and and especially the wraparound, and I was like, that, it's just like, I love it. And it had a kind of almost like old school sci-fi feel too, that took you back retro a little bit.
Yes.
And JATI'S Wager too, same thing, just these really great scenes. And I really like paintings and drawings as opposed to photographs for science fiction and fantasy. Absolutely. I feel like it's easier to kind of pull you into a believable secondary world visually. I think photographs can do it, but they need to be very digitally manipulated to really break and give you that, I'm going to use a word by Tolkien on fairy stories in his essay, enchantment, to create that kind of like enchantment where you're swept away. I feel like paintings can do that really well. Yes. And I wanted that. And, I'm also an art historian. And so art is my thing, and so I'm drawn to paintings to begin with. But all 3 books will be by the same artist. I already have the cover for the third. I have the cover for all 3. Nice. And then most of the work on the website is also by that artist. The image you have behind us right now, actually, was made by a colleague of mine at work, actually, at Moore College of Art and Design, Stephen Wood, who is a game arts professor and also is an artist, a digital artist, and makes all sorts of great work, mostly fantasy, actually. He creates RPG campaigns and does all his artwork for them and sells them on the D&D website. And so he's, very cool. Yeah, very cool. So he made that Cole 2 image for me. It was before the first book came out. And it was really the first piece of artwork that I've ever seen that you could call like fan art, right? Yeah. And it was the first time I actually had a tangible look at this imaginary thing that I invented in my head. And I mean, it was just so cool to look at that planet and see the rosy atmosphere, and see the blue for the sand. And, it was like, dang, like, there it is. And it's like, wow, that's really wild.
Well, that brings me to like a twofold question, right? Because I was wondering, as someone that loves science fiction, I know that you said that like A New Hope was sort of the thing that kind of opened up your eyes, but you saw it in the theaters, right?
Yeah.
You've seen A New Hope, and obviously you've seen like Dune books and now this Dune movie. Like science fiction art has evolved since A New Hope, and Ralph McQuarrie's artwork that inspired it, right? How do you feel as an art historian? How do you feel that science fiction artwork has evolved? Like what do you think, like the aesthetics of it? Like, do they change to react to our culture? Like, how do you think that science fiction art has evolved?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let me start by saying I am no expert, okay? Science fiction artwork is not my field of expertise. Okay. As an art historian, I'm a modern and contemporary person, but my areas are much more in the institutional boundaries of like the art you would expect to find in a avant-garde kind of a modern tradition, and then in a contemporary sense I'm pretty broad, but I'm actually not well versed. I am teaching a fantasy art and illustration class for the second time this coming semester. I taught it last year, and that was so much fun because they really educated me a lot on the history of fantasy art. And I dabbled a little bit in the sci-fi as a result, just because there's so many parallels. Right. And it was so interesting to see how fantasy art responded oftentimes to actual material conditions around the world and in different global contexts. And I think sci-fi does the same thing. So like, I mean, cyberpunk as a genre, both visually and in a literary sense, also derives very much from kind of economic changes in a kind of global, capitalist market, and then kind of thinking about that kind of accelerated, right, development and industrialization and the information age and all of those things that come out as we kind of move from the 60s and the 70s and 80s, and the kind of growth of these international, multinational corporations that wield new power and dominance in our society. That kind of, it makes sense, right? That we start pushing our attention towards those issues and those ideas. Same thing with, you know, ideas around the environment. Like if you look at Ursula Le Guin, I think Ursula Le Guin's a great example, who's someone who's thinking very closely at the time that she was writing about, you know, environmental issues, you know, things around not only social issues, but the earth itself, especially in the planet and where we were at, and this kind of new consciousness that was coming about. So there's always that connection. As a matter of fact, I would highly suggest anyone who's really interested in that connection between a kind of secondary world to the primary world. There's an introduction in Ursula Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness that is, I just love it. It's a go-to essay for me when I need a little like juice of inspiration. She talks about just why science fiction is relevant and why it is really about our world, even though it's might not be our world.
I feel like the artwork that I see on some book covers, and including your book cover too, and then some of the stuff you shared with me, I feel like some of it is influenced by RPGs and role-playing games, specifically like digital role-playing games, like games you play on the computer, right?
Yeah.
Like Mass Effect or Destiny. And I feel like the art design for those games is A, to be exciting for people to look at, but B, to work in a practical nature for the player itself. You know, they're obviously trying to conceal things from the players, and they're also trying to make it so that it's easy to control things. So it's interesting how like the mechanics of a video game might affect the aesthetics of a world, right? And the world building. And so I know that for me, as a guy that, you know, doesn't write really as much as he says he does, I visualize my stuff when I make my stories. Do you see these worlds? Do you see these ships in your head when you're writing them out?
Yeah, I want to say something though before we move on about what you were just talking about, because it's so interesting to me. Just, I think that's really interesting, that component of how I think visual art is affected by RPG gaming, because I think you're totally right. I think that especially from a perspectival kind of a position. So like, from what position are we seeing that world, right, as a player character in a game? Because, you know, when you're in the actual eyes of a player and seeing from their eyes, you're seeing in a way like almost like a first person experience. Whereas when you're behind the player in the world, right, you're still limited to that player, but you're seeing what's going on around them from a little outside. You're almost like a third person, like limited. So there's a lot of POV stuff that I think relates to RPG stuff, which is really interesting. And I do think you're right. I think it affects the artwork as well. So like JATI'S Wager, I'm looking at on the bottom of the screen there, you know, you're putting yourself right behind that ship. And, you know, it's like bringing you into that world. And it just reminds me of that. I did actually just do a blog post that's going to come out with someone talking about the relationship of writing science fiction and fantasy to playing RPGs.
Oh, okay.
And I was shocked at how much crossover there was. Thinking about like just that the stories and the way that you tell stories and experience stories. So that was really cool. But yeah, I'm very visual, to answer your question. I'm very visual. I see scenes. I see myself in scenes. I feel moods a lot. I don't know how to explain that, but it's like, you probably picked up on this in the book, like in Haroon, the rainforest planet, right? You know, there's an alluring, like there's a alluring quality there that's a little bit anxious and almost haunting at the same time that it's beautiful. And like that's more of an atmosphere that I feel in a place, and it comes to me through color, temperature, and sound. And yeah, I try to put that into words. I think that's where being an art historian helps me a little bit. Because I've spent so many years, you know, teaching where, you know, you're like, you know, you've got an artwork on a screen, right? And you're talking with students about a visual image, and you need to articulate and speak about what you're seeing. And I think that in writing about art maybe helps me become a writer who focuses on that as my kind of entry point. Whereas I think other people have various entry points, you know, that they use.
This year has just been like crazy for you, right? Because you have your first book came out in May, right?
Yeah.
And then this book just came out this week.
Yeah.
And then you have your next book coming out in November.
Yeah.
So was that the plan from the beginning to release all three in 1 year?
Yeah. So yeah, and it was fine until the end. My publishers, Jess and Mandy, will be like, "You're not supposed to say that," but no, it was. Yeah, it was the plan from the beginning, and the deal is, which is, I really like this actually. Now that it's done, is the idea was you backload, or front load, you backload, and so what you do is the first book is done and kind of ready to go, but you wait. And you finish writing the second book, and when that's basically almost ready to go, then you release the first book, and you're writing the third at that time so that they can come out in short order. So you don't end up with the problem of waiting like a year or two to go to the next book in the series, or end up waiting years. And so I really like the idea of them coming out in succession like that. It got a little harrowing to get the third one done. My deadline was about a week ago, and I did get it done. It was something else, but but it's done, and it's in editing now, which is great.
Cool.
But yeah, so it was a lot. Yeah, but the first book too, I had a lot of time with that first book. Had a lot of time with it before I subbed it out, put it out to queries and things like that. So that one had kind of already been pretty much, close to being ready to go by the time I signed. And at that point, I was ready to jump on to 2, and then 3. So we waited. So it was a good year and a half until my first book came out after I signed with them, because of the fact that we wanted to have enough of the cycle going so that we could release them quickly.
Right. And that's Shadow Spark Publishing. Right?
Yep, Shadow Spark Publishing. Yeah, that is, by the way, opening for submissions, I think this week or next week, briefly, for a brief window. So if anyone's interested, go to shadowspark.com. Jessica Moon and Mandy Russell run the pub house, and we're a small indie press. And they do a great job.
Do you have a plan to work in this universe after your third book, or like do you have plans for a book after the trilogy is over?
Yeah, so I just signed a contract with Shadow Spark to do a standalone novel after this, which will be in a separate universe. It's going to be a true standalone, a one-story book. It's going to be a space adventure, and I wanted to. This trilogy kind of wrapped up, and I wanted to take a break from it and step away.
Yeah.
You said this is a big world. And man, was it a big world. And writing that third book and, dealing with the, it's like the Return of the Jedi, the Return of the King, right? All these third movies and books, you have a lot of promises to make good on.
Yes.
And a lot of loose ends to wrap up. And, I just felt like after that, I was like, okay, I felt like those characters, they're good now. Like they don't need me anymore for now. They're ready to go and continue living their lives now from where I left them.
Right.
And I know that sounds kind of weird, but if maybe you're right. Like characters become real people to you. And so they're all okay for now. But I did leave lots of Easter eggs along the way so I could come back. So I'm going to play it by ear and write the standalone, and then either move on. I have dreams of writing a true space science fantasy series at some point.
Okay.
But I probably will come back someday. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I enjoyed your book very much, and I think that if people are interested, I'm going to leave a link to your website in the description below too. But if you want to do any kind of like plugging too, just so that people know where to find you, where to find your books.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. This was absolutely great. I really appreciate it, Pete. And you do an awesome job always on your channel. If you're interested, you can find me at jonathannevair.com. I'm also on Twitter at jnevair. And you can get to me through Shadow Spark Publishing. So JATI'S Wager Book 2 just came out this past Tuesday. And that's the second book in the series. And it is a space opera heist meets a kind of coming of age story. So it's got a kind of like an Ocean's 11 thing going on, mixed, with a space opera setting, a little bit of maybe like a Fifth Element thing in there. It's a lot of fun, and it's very different from the first book too.
Okay.
But that's out now, and then No Song But Silence will be out November 18th.
Yes.
And that'll be the conclusion to the trilogy. So you can find the books on Amazon and Goodreads, as Barnes and Noble, etc. Bookshop, as well.
Yeah. And so after people read book 1 and book 2, they have their Thanksgiving meal. They sit down and they read. Yeah, your third book.
They go see Dune, and then after Dune, they're chomping at the bit for something more.
Yeah, just give me some more of that space opera.
Right? Exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Jonathan, it's been a real pleasure, man, and I'd love to have you back on the show to talk some more about your books too.
Thanks so much, Pete. I really appreciate it.